Welcome everybody to this edition of Radical Feminist Perspectives. It's a women-only webinar. It's run by radical feminists whose voices have been cancelled or silenced in universities, schools and the media. Frustrated that we cannot share what we know in these places, we're offering this online series of webinars and I hope you enjoy it. Today, we're going to discuss Unspeakable, a feminist ethic of speech by McLellan. And we've got McLellan herself, and she's going to be talking with Lecuona. So I'll hand over to Lara.
Thank you, Dorothea. Good morning or good evening. Thank you very much for being here with us. Good evening, Betty. It's 7 o'clock for you there in Australia.
Well, it sure is. Thank you.
When I first proposed Joe speaking here about Unspeakable by Betty McLellan, I hadn't thought of the possibility of the author herself being here with us. But it turned out she was available and willing to come, and that is amazing. So after presenting her and talking a bit about her book and sharing with you some quotes from the book, I will ask her some questions. The book is titled Unspeakable, a feminist ethic of speech. It was published by Spinif Express, a radical feminist independent publisher based in Australia, and a very important window for feminist thought. Renate Klein and Susan Hawthorne, their founders and directors, published feminist books which would be banned elsewhere. I got to know this book by Betty McLellan, thanks to Sheila Jeffries, who recommended it to me because of my interest and preoccupation about free speech. It is a concern for us radical feminists because of the constant attempts to silence us and negate our right to speak our minds and defend our sex-based rights. But at the same time, the concept is very problematic for us because free speech has been historically claimed by males to defend the supposed right to produce and view pornography, to give the best known example. Of course, as feminists who oppose the sexualization and commodification of women, we are against pornography, but it's difficult to say we are against freedom of expression. It is finally a core principle of democratic societies. And the silencing of women has been one of the main ways to secure the nomination of men and the subordination of women. So there's a dilemma here. In fact, the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights reaffirms our freedom of opinion and expression. And it says women have the right to hold opinions without interference. This should include the right to hold and express opinions about gender identity, quote unquote, without being subject to harassment, prosecution, or punishment. So how do feminists navigate this seeming contradiction of claiming our freedom of expression while opposing some manifestations of others' free speech? Those who defend free speech rightly claim that free speech means defending, or free speech obliges you to defend even speech which you don't like or which is against your own beliefs. We radical feminists nowadays often listen to people who want to negate our freedom of speech because they claim our opinions are hate speech and they shouldn't respect our freedom of expression, and that is all there is to say for them. But of course, there's much else to say. I had the intuition, returning to this clash between freedom of expression and opposing pornography, that one possible way was negating pornography, the condition of speech. But Betty McLellan's, and indeed Andrea Dworkin's position, is very different. In fact, they say, and I agree with them now having read this book, the harm of pornography lies mainly in what it says about women. So we have to give it the position, the condition of speech. Pornography is speech. So I learned a lot when reading this book. It is a very different approach from the one we find in recent books about the subject, such as Free Speech and Why It Matters by Andrew Doyle. This is not surprising, of course, because Betty McLellan's book presents a very strong and clear radical feminist view that a book by a man cannot have. So I will give a very quick overview of the book because we want to listen to Betty herself, and I'll read some quotes from it, and then Betty McLellan will answer some questions, will kindly answer some questions I will ask her. Well, the first words of the introduction are this. Betty says, this book is about speech and the silencing of speech. It is an analysis of who gets to speak and who does not, who is listened and who is ignored. Who is listened to and who is ignored. That's the quote from Betty. But I should say this book is about much more than speech. It is about feminist ethics, about economy, power relations, the importance of the feminist movement and feminist activism, the present state of feminism. So really, it is also a great introduction to the main problems in radical feminists are facing today. In the introduction, Betty explains that her book is a feminist ethical inquiry into the concept and practice of freedom of speech. And she remembers that 19th century feminism in the United States identified the inability to speak and be heard as central to the problems being experienced by women at the time. She also explains several central concepts as that of feminist ethics, justice as different from equality, violence, subordination, exclusion, and of course, feminism, the concept of feminism. There is a very interesting review of the divisions within feminism from the 1970s to the present. So, Dorothea, can we have the first slide, please? I think there it is. Okay, so while there is wide agreement, says Betty McLellan, among citizens of all democratic countries that freedom of speech is a basic and universal human right, crucial questions remain unresolved. Do people have a right to free speech if it is not also fair speech? Can it really be said that people enjoy the right of free speech when what they say is most often ignored, or when their life conditions are such that they are afraid to speak their thoughts? Attention to the speech of both sexes reveals that it is women who are most often the victims of free speech, which is not fair speech, and also that it is women whose speech is most often ignored or ridiculed, and women who most often develop a fear of speaking their true thoughts. In this introduction, which is a long one, Betty runs through several feminists' opinions on the importance of speech, such as Mary Daly, Adrienne Rich, Audre Lorde, Dale Spender, Julia Penelope, and she offers, for example, and next slide, please, Dorothea, she offers this beautiful quote by Susan B. Anthony, which says, so I don't know if you, there it is. Thank you, Dorothea. The moment we begin to fear the opinions of others and hesitate to tell the truth that is in us, and for motives of policy are silent when we should speak, the divine floods of light and life no longer flow into our souls. Of course, nowadays we wouldn't use, radical feminists certainly wouldn't use this kind of language, divine floods of light and life and souls, but it is an experience we maybe most of us have, fearing the opinions of others, hesitating to tell what we want to say, and remain silent. And also we want women, other women, to stop being silent. We want to invite them to speak their minds. But I will rush a little to the one of the last chapters. Betty McLellan said that is something original in her book, invites us to think about the effects of our speaking and inviting others to speak, because it's a fact that it is not always safe. We should take into account the possible effects of our speech in the lives of others. But before getting there, now can we have the third slide, please, Dorothea? Here's another quote from Betty, who says, "Since the 1960s, radical feminists have continuously condemned practices which diminish and degrade women. To this day, they express the view that practices which subordinate women to men entrench inequality and render women's speech inconsequential. It follows, they maintain, that the voices of women made inconsequential by violence and subordination are easy to exclude from discussions and decision-making on issues of national and international significance. Violence, subordination, and exclusion work together to keep women silenced." This is a very important quote, I think, because it's not enough telling what we think. It's not enough to speak. If nobody listens to us because we, for example, in Twitter, because we are our shadow banned, is our free speech being respected? Is there some kind of fair speech in view? Of course not. And maybe some of you have heard trans activists say that we have free speech. Of course, we can speak, but we don't have the right to have an audience. That is absurd. That is of course a stupid argument, because fair speech, and Betty McLellan explains it, fair speech needs someone to listen to what someone else is saying. Women have been excluded, and even if they speak, they are not listened to. So the right to a fair speech is not being enacted. Can we have the next slide, please, Dorothea? Betty says, "The two major themes of this book are speech and silence. An examination of the democratic principle of freedom of speech reveals that in this neoliberal, capitalist, globalized, male-dominated, violent world, speech is free only to those who enjoy the privilege and safety of economic and political power. Men at the top of multinational corporations, media corporations, and powerful political administrations have unlimited access to speech, and they have ears only for each other's speech. While they speak and respond to each other, however, their speech, their competitiveness, the power games they play with each other, dominate the lives of the rest of us. When speech belongs to the powerful, those with little or no power have little or no access to speech." So the concept of fair speech, which he proposes in this book, is the answer to this problem. In chapter 1, Betty analyzes the different arguments given for free speech in law and politics and their weaknesses, and she outlines the feminist argument for equality. Can we have the next slide, please? Here's another good quote. When women are excluded, it is clear confirmation that freedom of speech, as it exists in so-called democratic countries, is a right only for those who enjoy the power that comes from membership in the dominant male group. The freedom of speech of women and other disempowered people exists only if and when their words are acceptable to the dominant group. And of course, radical feminist words almost never are acceptable to the dominant group. And chapter 2 poses an analogy between free trade versus fair trade and free speech versus fair speech. And citing Vandana Shiva, Betty remembers how free trade is a myth that robs the poor of the right to food. Can we have the next slide, please? There it is. Thank you. Although no one in any democratic country anywhere in the world would advocate abolishing the principle of free speech, many are calling for limitations on the freedom of those whose speech effectively denies others the democratic right to speech. They contend that for free speech to have and to maintain credibility, every effort must be made to ensure that access to speech is freely available to all. Fair speech is a term coined here to draw attention to the fact that for any nation to ensure access to speech for all its citizens, attention must be given to issues of equality and justice. The feminist argument for equality in speech is an argument for justice and equity for women and for all other categories of people who are subordinated by the speech of others. Other problems with free trade and with free speech are that it fosters and entrenches inequality, it focuses on the individual and ignores quality of life. The same can be said of free speech, says Betty McLellan. Both freedoms favor the powerful and entrench injustice. So Betty focuses on the theory and practice of fair speech. It is in this same chapter 2 where the problems posed by pornography to the defense of free speech are presented. Can we have the next slide, please? Says Betty McLellan. In defining pornography as graphic, sexually explicit materials that subordinate women through pictures and words, Andrea Dworkin and McKinnon sought to highlight the fact that pornography harms women by what it says, that is, its function as defamation or hate speech, and more particularly by what it does, that is, its role as subordination, as sex discrimination, including what it does through what it says. Feminist moral philosopher Ray Langton, engaging with these ideas, discusses the possibility that pornography is a speech act which depicts subordination, causes subordination, and in fact is subordination. Chapter 3 is a central one in this book. It takes a look at the different forms the silencing of women's voices has adopted throughout history, mainly through violence. And the next slide presents a quote to depict this. Here it is, thank you. The exclusion of women and women's voices from national and international arenas is no mere oversight. In every generation, the exclusion is deliberate. In today's neoliberal capitalist world, power is kept in the hands of the few. Women, especially dissenting feminists, are not included. Some who claim to be feminists are included, but they are usually the ones whose agenda is to speak the words the patriarchal elite want to hear, and are chosen for the value as token women. This chapter 3 also explains how poverty is incompatible with fair speech, both at the national and the individual level. Can we have the next slide? Thank you. It is not difficult to see, says Betty McLellan, how whole nations, as well as individual citizens, are silenced by poverty. Any nation forced to focus on repaying the interest on its debt over and over is forever in a state of powerlessness and inferiority in relation to other nations, and therefore silenced. Individual citizens living in poverty with little or no access to basic health and education are silenced by the need to focus day after day on their own family survival. So, as we all know, the most poor people in the world are women, and poverty is a way to keep women silent. But there are other strategies. In chapter 4, McLellan discusses the two main strategies used by those in power to silence dissenting voices, not only women, but women among dissenting voices, of course. Systematic silencing through propaganda, that is, manipulation of the minds of the general population, and targeted silencing. I'm not sure if there's a quote from chapter 4. Can we see the next slide, please, Dorothea? Oh, yes, there it is. While the rhetoric of governments in so-called democratic countries supports the principle of freedom of speech as the cornerstone of democracy, and all sections of the media demand freedom of the press, there is a certain degree of hypocrisy in the relationship to such freedoms. On the one hand, governments and media express the view that censorship is unacceptable in a democracy. On the other hand, they have no hesitation in censoring those who hold views that differ from their own. Many of us have experienced firsthand this hypocrisy. And chapter 5 will also resonate with many of us. It discusses women silencing women, including feminists silencing feminists, the campaign by heterosexual feminists to silence lesbian feminists during the 1970s and 1980s, and involuntary racism within the movement. These are difficult topics, of course. Can we see if the next slide has a, the quote is from chapter 6, Speaking the Unspeakable, which studies the ethical implications of speaking and of not speaking for women in general, for the feminist movement, and for each woman in particular. And this is the last slide. Let me read it before asking Betty some questions. The task radical feminists have set for themselves in the 21st century is to be alert to the tactics of silencing and commit to speaking through the silencing with the deliberate aim of defying and disrupting those forces intent on violating, subordinating, and excluding women. So it was very difficult to try to condense in 15 or 20 minutes everything that this book tells us, but I really recommend reading it. Here's Betty to answer some questions I'm asking her. Let me introduce her. Betty is a feminist ethicist, author, psychotherapist, and activist of long standing. With a focus on both the personal and political, she has successfully combined her work as a psychotherapist with a broader emphasis on feminist ethical analysis and activism. Her books reveal that dual interest. The first one was about anxiety conditions, the next about feminist therapy, then her third and most popular book, Help, I Am Living with the Man-Boy, was about relationship issues. Next came Unspeakable, then a psychological biography of her grandmother, and a new book to be launched later this month, Truth abandoned. How can democracy survive? A feminist response. So welcome, Betty, and thank you very much for being here with us and accepting the invitation.
Thank you, Laura, very much. Thank you for sharing, for allowing me to come in and share this platform with you. Thank you too for that introduction. That was very, very important for me to see the bits of those chapters that you'd pulled out and presented. So thank you for that.
So no, you're welcome. Thank you for being here and accepting to be here on so short notice. As I said at the beginning, I wasn't aware there was a possibility of having you here, but when I heard of it, I was very excited. So it's great to have you here. And so let's now that you are here, could you please tell us, why did you write Unspeakable?
Well, because as I look back on that, like, it's very hard to look back and say, talk about a book that I wrote and what was I thinking about way back then. But as I've thought about that, preparing for this, I realized that the decade, the 2000s, was a very important decade in my life in terms of feminist activism. You know, the turn of the millennium, a friend and I decided that when we saw, you know, about the World March of Women, when we saw the program about the World March of Women, it was about poverty, about women, poverty, human rights. We thought, you know, we as a group here in Townsville wanted to be involved in that, but one other friend and I, we decided that we would actually go to Washington, D.C. and join in the festivities there for the World March of Women. So it was like we went to Rome first and joined there, and then we went to Washington, D.C. And it was a kind of experience where we were immersed in those issues. The poverty that women endure, the violence that women endure, and that somehow just like kept on going over in my mind. Then in 2002, there were 4 of us women here in Townsville who decided that it was time Townsville got on the world map, the world feminist map, and we would run a Townsville International Women's Conference. So we did, and Sheila, of course, was one of our speakers. That was so wonderful. But we ran this conference, and 450 women from around the world came to Townsville. Now, who's ever heard of Townsville? You know, we thought, oh, no one would want to come here, but they did, and it was a really important experience, focused always on radical feminist issues. So we thought, well, that was good. So then in 2004, we organised something else. 2007, we organised the International Feminist Summit, and Catherine McKinnon, we invited her to come, and she came. So all the time throughout that decade, these ideas were in my head. And particularly the whole issue of free speech and fair speech for me at that time, I must say, was focused around 2 issues that have always been really important to me. One is violence against women and how women are silenced in their homes and also in the street and internationally because of men's violence against them, and also pornography. And of course, Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon's work was so influential in my thinking about this. So that's like the whole decade, it seemed to me, was feeding into my thoughts about this book. The whole business of who gets free speech. Like, I've always thought, oh, well, free speech in a democracy, that's fine, everyone gets free speech. But when you really think about it, who does get free speech? And the quotes that you read to us, Laura, says, you know, well, it's the powerful who get free speech. That's the kind of thing I was saying. And the rest of us, mainly women, are silenced. Yes, we're allowed to speak in a democracy. Isn't that wonderful? We can have our demonstrations, our protests, but who cares? You know, it's like they don't care about our protests and our speech. So in that way, we are silenced. That's the kind of thing that was pushing me to write this book.
So listening to you speak about a conference in which 450 women attended, that's amazing. And it's difficult to believe we could now in 2024 organize a radical feminist conference, which so many women being able to assist. And I don't know what would happen. Maybe the conference wouldn't be able to take place. Where would it take place? No,
I think you're right. I think you're right, because we have also in Townsville, we used to have weekend workshops over on Magnetic Island, and 50 women would come from all around the district. But now it's like women, young women in particular, prefer just to be on social media, I suppose, and they're not getting themselves into that kind of face-to-face stuff where they can be influenced, I guess, to be more radical in their thinking.
That's a pity. Because there are some things we are gaining through social media, and of course the international feminism is gaining much from it, but we are on the other hand losing this eye-to-eye contact, which is
Yes.
so important.
Yes.
So this leads me to the next question, Betty. What has changed for women, and particularly for radical feminists, in relation to free speech and fair speech since you wrote the book 15 years ago?
Oh, yes. I mean, that's such an interesting question, because part of me wants to say nothing much has changed. But then I also want to say, well, no, certain things have changed for women. Like women now do have the courage to say the Me Too movement, things like that. You know, they have the courage to get involved in things like that. And while I don't see that as a radical feminist endeavor, I still think it's an important thing that women are able to and willing to express themselves in that way. See, I do think a lot of things have changed in the last, say, decade. In terms of women, so for example, in Australia, one of our political parties, the Labor Party, which is the party on the left, you might say, the moderate left, they introduced a quota for women, so that now they have to have, as much as possible, equal men and women as politicians. And like, it's made a big difference in Parliament to have so many women speaking and having influence in that way. Whereas the right, the party on the right, which is our so-called Liberal Party, the Coalition Party, they refuse to have quotas, and therefore they are very heavily still male-dominated. So, I mean, things like that have changed, but I'm sorry to say that change happens so gradually. And women get to speak, but still, even say in these parties where there are equal men and women politicians, it still seems to me that the patriarchal view dominates, and we've still got a lot of work to do in that area, I think. see, I think what we realize is that no matter what we do, the patriarchal machine is determined to keep one step ahead of us, so that our insistence on fair speech for women has resulted now, of course, in men becoming women. And then the speech of those men in women's clothing, you might say, gets all the attention. So it's like governments are saying, well, we're listening to women. But in terms of the trans issue, they're listening to the trans so-called women's voices. So it's like patriarchy, like we can never get ahead of them, because there's always something else that comes out that we have to fight against.
Mm-hmm. In fact, when I thought about this question, I wasn't imagining things changing for the better, but for the worse, because I have the impression that, although, as you so well explain in the book, the silencing of women is nothing new, and it has many forms. I have the impression that it is more, that nowadays it's more
Subtle.
Less subtle, so to say. No, we see men who don't make any effort to conceal their desire to shut us up.
Yes, I agree with that. I think that's true. It's almost like, because we have had the courage to speak, they now are speaking louder and in an attempt to shut us up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's always the patriarchal way, isn't it? Like with domestic violence issues, men's violence against women in the home. If a woman speaks up about it, then of course his violence has to come in over the top of that, and he gets more violent very often. So no matter what we do, men are going to come in, unless, of course, we're liberal feminists who work within the male system. And, you know, I mean, their aim is to reason with men on their terms and all that. So they are more accepted, of course, and we have to remember that their protests are often more accepted than ours, that there are changes that are made because liberal feminists have worked within the system. You know, now I'm not going to criticize that, but I don't want to, that's not where I want to work. But men are all, like for women like ourselves, we are, what did Mary Daly call it? Women on the boundary, right? We're on the boundary, and we're looking in and focusing in and protesting in, and that's the sort of thing that men are very angry about.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true. I'm happy you mentioned liberal feminists, because I didn't understate enough, underlined enough the fact that throughout your book there's this distinction between how liberal feminists work and how radical feminists work, and that is very illuminating. So I want to ask you as well, if could you imagine back then, when you wrote the book, that women would be interrogated by the police for treating, for example, that men can't be women, or faced prison for not allowing men into women's spaces?
we could never have imagined it, could we? I could never have imagined that.
Mhm.
And I could never have imagined that some of our political parties that call themselves progressive, at least in my country, that they could be brought into that hook, line, and sinker, and they approve of that. Like if we use the wrong pronoun, it's even politicians who are against us for doing that. I could never have imagined that that would happen.
Mhm.
But
Yes. Excuse me?
it does happen, and it's total madness. I think it's total madness, and it's identity politics. It seems to me that it has such power these days. It seems to me that most activists, say human rights activists, liberal feminist activists, they've really got onto this, the bandwagon of identity politics. And because there's an identity that is a person who has talked about how discriminated against they are because they're transgender. All of these good people have jumped onto this, and they're on their side no matter what. And the rest of us who want to really look at the whole issue intelligently and sensibly, it's like we're silenced. We lose our jobs. People lose their jobs, don't they? Not only women, but men as well, who have spoken out about this, lose their jobs over this. It's just ridiculous.
Yes, but for someone who has read your book, it is evident that the fact that these people are being given such a platform is an indication of their power. No,
Yes.
and this doesn't come from nowhere. We even women who haven't seen the whole picture and who are still ignorant about what transgenderism means, or who haven't read or listened to Jennifer Bilek, for example, who has denounced all the money behind the transgender movement. The sole fact that they are platformed everywhere, and all the newspapers, all the TV shows, all the the media are all about this, should be suspicious. No, that only fact should make someone suspicious of what lies behind it. The fact that they are platformed everywhere. No, that that's a sign to the power they hold. So there's another question I'm very eager to ask you, because I'm very interested of listening to you, of listening. What do you think? What is your opinion about Kelly J. Keen's work and the Let Women Speak movement? Don't you want to tell me?
Well, it's such a difficult question, isn't it? I mean, it's another one. This is the issue on which we radical feminists are in tune with women on the right, and yet we come at the whole issue from a different angle. So I mean, I think, I like the fact that there are women. I don't know what. I was just looking to see what her name was. I think of her as Posey Parker, but as Kelly J. Keen, I don't know what her politics are really, but I presume from her following that she is more, say, right-wing than I am, let's face it. So it's very important that they have a platform to speak, but it worries me if I am bundled in with them and seen to be the same and have the same attitudes as them, because I don't want to dismiss people who struggle with anything to do with their sexual identity. I don't want to dismiss that and say that they should be this or they should be that. If someone wants to, you know, a man wants to put on a dress and say, I'm a woman, well, that's okay. But there are certain things that I really don't like and don't agree with. And that is that they then take over what it means to be a woman, and that women like ourselves are silenced. That's one thing that is just incredibly, and another thing that that bothers me a little bit. I'm not quite sure about this, but I'm not sure about saying this, but it does bother me that people are easily now allowing the mutilation of their bodies. That it just bothers me. I don't know even how to think any further about that, but I just think there's so much of it happening with non-binary people, with transgender people. And anyway, but what I'm saying in answer to your question is, I go to these conferences that Sheila mentioned in Brisbane, and Anna McCormack, who is an excellent radical feminist, she runs a conference that has very extremist right-wing women speaking, and also people like Sheila and myself and so on speaking. You know, it's like she brings us all together, except that we're not together. You know, like we give our own papers and we have different views, but there we are all together in the conference. So in answer to your question, I don't want to be aligned with Kelly J. Keane, but I don't want to say she shouldn't be doing what she's doing.
No, of course. Well, thank you very much for your answer, Betty. I wasn't aware what either it was such a sensible question, but thank you for answering it.
Would you tell me what you think about that?
Yeah. In fact, I love what she does. I admire her way of telling things as she thinks them. Of course, I don't agree with her on everything, but I very much like her braveness, how she doesn't shut up, even though many people want her to. And also I see, as you say, you don't want to be aligned with her. I think many women don't want to be aligned with her, but that causes something you mentioned in your book, that causes those women to not speak out, because no, they will see I think the same as Kelly J. Keane, but I don't want to be related to her. I don't want them to think I'm with her or I'm like her. And this happens. So I'm not shy about this. I admire Kelly J. Keane, even though there are things I don't agree with her. And she's funny. She's and this Let Women Speak thing, I think it's very important. Many women going on a regular basis to these events she's organizing. And also it is important that she's showing the world what trans activists are capable of doing. if they want to silence a woman, no, what they're doing to her when they throw things at her, and she has said she has feared for her life in some of the events she has gone to, and no, and so I think she does a good work. So that's it.
Well, I agree that it's important that there is a woman and women who are standing up and saying, I'm not going to be silenced. But it's just that from my perspective, it's just that the politics are probably different.
Yes, and thinking on your last chapter, to when you invite women to think about the consequence of their actions, because even when we speak out, it can be dangerous. Maybe I'm sure there are women who have accused Kelly J. King of putting women at risk in her conferences. So
Yes.
so maybe this is another line of discussion surrounding Kelly J. King. But there's another question I'd like to ask you before we go out of time, and it's do you think the concept of hate speech, which you mentioned in the book a few times, is useful in light of its current use to silence feminists who don't cave into transactivism demands?
What was your question? Is it useful?
Is it useful? What can we do about this?
Yes.
For example, I prefer not to use it because my opponents always use it against me. And who determines what speech is hate speech? But you use it a few times in the book, so I'd like to know what you think.
Well, I think it's still a powerful term, and see, it's another one of those things that patriarchy has tried to steal from us. Like, there are so many of the words that we used to use supporting women, like the empowerment of women. Well, neoliberalism came in and took that word and said women are empowered individually, you know, to make more money and to all that stuff. So they take our words, and I think hate speech is another phrase that I guess I'm not willing to give that one up, because they can accuse me of hate speech, that's fine, but I can also analyze behaviors, analyze things, and say, yep, this is hate speech. Certainly in the area of racial discrimination, there's a lot of hate speech that is there in racial discrimination, and also discrimination against women, of course, with all these groups like the incels and so on that are formed really on the basis of hatred of women, I think. Anyway, the term itself, I'm not prepared to hand it over to the trans activists who would then use it against me. If they're going to use it against me, I'm going to continue to use it anyway.
I understand, but even so, I think it's problematic, because I think you propose several concepts which are much more useful and less subjective, so to say. I prefer to talk about violence. That is something more objective, but the thing with hate speech is, am I not allowed to hate? People are allowed to hate, if that doesn't mean they're going to be violent against those whom they hate. No, it's an emotion, and how can you forbid emotions? It's a difficult concept, even in other areas, even if they don't accuse us of it. That's what I think, but it would be material for an interesting conversation.
Yes.
Another time. So even though your book problematizes these concepts and shows how women are systematically silenced and there's no this won't change in a short time. Even so, you remain optimistic, and you there are things we can do, and you tell us you tell us what things we can do. But can you tell the audience what can each of us do to help achieve the goal of fair speech for all?
Well, I think what we can do is, like it seems to me that the very first thing is we must never give up. Like, I mean, that's the kind of, that's something we can do, is remain activist, remain determined that we're not going to give up. That's one thing. And I mean, we just have to keep on speaking. Now, you know, I've been speaking for decades, as have many feminists, about these things. And really, sometimes you look at them and you think, nothing's really changed, even though I've been saying this for X number of decades. But we must not stop, because otherwise it will just go backwards. I mean, I think sometimes we are just holding the line. But if that's our role at this time in history, then that's what we have to do. And we also must make sure, as I said in the book, and you've mentioned, that our own speech is fair speech. And as we said before, people often say if you have a different view to someone else, then they think that's being violent towards them, or that's not fair. But we need to develop this, again, this democratic principle that we can disagree and have that kind of fairness in our dialogue with each other. But we have to keep the lines of communication, at least from our side, open, even though they might not want to listen to us and they've closed off to us. We, I think, have to keep on speaking about these things and writing about these things. That's what I think. Mm-hmm.
Reading your book gives energy to one who doesn't want to stop speaking. So we have 2 more minutes. Could you please tell us about your new book, Truth Abandoned, to be released later this month?
Well, of course, that's what's at this moment foremost in my mind. And it's quite exciting. I mean, look, I started writing this book on truth around about the end of 2019. I started thinking about it and started writing. And I know the date because then COVID came along and we were, you know, confined to our homes sometimes. And I thought, well, this is good because I can focus on this new idea I've got for a book. But the thing is that what I've written in the book we've been talking about tonight is just as relevant today, because those same ideas about truth, about freedom of speech, about democracy, well, they're certainly the things that we're fighting against still today, aren't they? They're the things that we're talking about. And the question, how can democracy survive, I think is a very serious question and a very relevant one. Let's not just brush it aside. I think it's very important. And for women, if we don't have democracy, well, I mean, look at the women of Afghanistan, the kinds of things that have happened to them and so on. So we need to fight for democracy. And what I say in this current book is I actually say, give some ways that what I say is feminism is going to lead the way out of the situation that we're in today. Now, I know that's just idealistic, but I think as feminists, we need to start thinking like that. Okay, is there a way for feminists to take the lead in this? Well, yeah, perhaps this is one way that we can do it. The same as climate activists need to say, how can I help to lead the way out of this? You know, so that's the kind of thing I've tried to do in this book. How can we join together with other activists, with other people, and say, okay, we're not going to take this lying down. We're going to keep on pushing forward so that democracy will be saved. That's what I think.
Great.
Anyway.
I look forward to reading it, Betty. And I hope you present it here in Radical Feminist Perspectives. And thank you very much for being here tonight. And
good.
We're out of time, but
yes, it's been very good. Thank you.
Okay. See you soon.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.